Panelists, unmute yourselves so that you're ready to speak. I want to just welcome you all here. It's a real pleasure to be with you wherever you are. My name is Ayala Fader. I'm a professor of anthropology in Fordham's Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And I'm going to be your moderator for what promises to be a fascinating and timely conversation on ultra-Orthodox and haredi Jewish responses to the current pandemic. Let me, before we actually get to the substantive part of our discussion, begin by thanking Magda Tedder, who's the director of Fordham's Center for Jewish Studies and who created this platform for us to have this discussion and has been so supportive. And I want to thank you all, of course, for joining us as well. We're really excited to host 3 social science scholars today, a sociologist and 2 anthropologists, whose ethnographic work spans England, Israel, and the US. And it's very unusual to have everybody in the same space, virtual or not, to have these kinds of discussions. It doesn't happen, I think, often enough. This is how our event will unfold. I'm going to briefly introduce each speaker and then pose some questions for our panelists to discuss with each other. And then after that, we'll be happy to open up the floor and take your questions. I'm sure as so many of you are getting more familiar with Zoom, you know that you can write questions by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I promise we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the final segments of this conversation. All right. So let me, with no further ado, begin by introducing our panelists. I'm going to begin with Ben. Ben, if you want to just raise your hand so everybody knows who you are. Yep. So Ben Caston, who's affiliated with Hebrew University and the University of Sussex, has a Ph.D. from Durham University and is a medical anthropologist. His research explores public health relations with minority groups and is currently focused on vaccine decision-making among Haredi Jews in Israel after the international measles outbreaks. His most recent book is Making Bodies Kosher, which was just published, and examines how Haredi Jews in England navigate healthcare services. So it's very relevant to understanding the dilemmas posed by COVID-19. And Making Bodies Kosher actually is available as an open access download, so it's freely available after our conversation if you'd like to explore further. And Ben is currently the associate editor for Anthropology and Medicine. Our second panelist is Schneur Zalman. Now, please also wave to our audience. Is Schneur Zalman Newfield. He's affiliated with BMCC CUNY. He has a Ph.D. from NYU's Department of Sociology, and his research interests focus on cultural sociology and the study of identity, narrative, and resocialization. In particular, he's interested in the processes individuals undergo when making major life transitions. His new book, Degrees of Separation, Identity Formation While Leaving Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, which is just out in April, explores the lives of a group of men and women who were raised in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities and decided to leave that way of life. And then finally, we have Leah Taragin-Zeller, who's affiliated with Cambridge and the Technion in Israel. She trained at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and in Cambridge, England. Leah's interests lie in the anthropology of religion, medical anthropology, gender and sexuality, and the anthropology of education. She's published widely in leading journals in sociology, anthropology, and religion, and she serves as a section editor in Cambridge's Journal of Reproductive Biomedicine and Society Online. Her current collaborative project, which is coming out of the Technion and the University of Haifa, explores whether and how the Haredi community in Israel is legitimating and appropriating scientific knowledge. All right. Welcome to everybody. So to open our discussion, I'm going to just ask each of our panelists to give us a very brief, maybe 2-minute overview of how the communities you've worked with have responded to the pandemic over the current months. So we get a sort of state of the field in each national contexts. Ben, do you want to just begin?
Sure, Ayala, thanks for the introduction. So just as a starting point, to take the title of the panel, Orthodox Jews versus the state, it might be tempting to look at that as a kind of binary or opposition, but we should be cautious about generalizing because they might play out very differently at different places. So to take the UK, the UK government has probably had one of the most irresponsible responses to COVID in the European Union. And we need to understand that public health failure when trying to understand the responses of Haredi Jews or any other population. It was all very ambiguous, and it continues to be ambiguous from a kind of public health messaging perspective. But at the same time, we can't take away the failure of religious authorities and communities to respond. We know that during the lockdown, there were mikvaot weren't closed, synagogues, minyanim were still going on behind closed doors, and weddings were also going on, which raises big kind of questions of, you know, which rabbanim are officiating those weddings, why there weren't kind of why the realization wasn't kind of communicated, or why that message wasn't heeded, and how the kind of the enormity of the situation from a kind of pikuach nefesh perspective, because these are not in opposition, why these weren't kind of acted upon. So there's a responsibility that we need to understand on each side. I think it can be very tempting to say that information wasn't reaching the communities, but there are always paths of crossing, and we need to kind of really understand what went on between the two, because it wasn't just Haredim who were affected. Of course, there were Jewish deaths from across the continuum, but more of the issues around social distancing and focus certainly seem to be on Haredim.
Thank you. Leah, you want to continue?
Sure. Thank you, Ben, for the intro. And I guess vis-a-vis the UK, Ben, you started by talking about how UK took a while. Israel seemed to be a little bit quicker to move. And, you know, the first weeks of the corona in Israel, the media was kind of every single day reporting pictures and a lot of critique about the Haredi community in Israel, really kind of vilifying, and I would say also kind of constructing Haredi Jews as, you know, very irresponsible, dangerous for the social body, etc. So in the Israeli context, it was definitely something that was very much, I would say, vilified in the media. And like you say, I mean, partially rightfully so, it did take Haredim a little bit longer to kind of get the message of social distancing through. At the Technion, like Ayala mentioned, I'm working with a group of people on Haredim and science communication, and we put a survey out really in the beginning. And it's amazing what questions people ask. And I want to share just one question to maybe help you understand where this was coming from. One person asked a question, and he said, can I go and visit and do bikur cholim for someone who has corona? So I bring that as a question, showing us that there is also a misunderstanding about how contagious this was from the front in Haredi circles, but also how it raises particular religious tensions vis-a-vis religious obligations. So we think a lot about communal prayer, etc., but there's also a lot of basic religious obligations that really come to the fore, and that this type of pandemic raises, especially the parts of Jewish life that are much more communal. It raises a lot of questions, and I would be really happy if we discuss that more. And I'd also just say one more thing before we go, is that there's a lot of things that's changed, but there's also a lot of things that really stay the same. And what I find really interesting in this case is you can also see how there's a lot of very similar tensions, intercommunal tensions between rabbis that just continue to proliferate as this kind of goes on. So I also want to speak about what's going different, but I would also love to speak about the things that are actually quite similar.
Thank you. And Zalman?
Yes, so to pick up on what Ben said, is certainly it's not possible to really reflect on the response of Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, to the corona pandemic without looking at the national response to the issue. And certainly in America, the Trump response has been an international fiasco that has certainly complicated the ability for average American citizens in general and Haredim as well, to understand just how extensive and how best to respond to it. At the same time, there's no doubt that we've seen many troubling behaviors on the part of members of the Hasidic and the Haredi, as was mentioned, issues of people going to rogue or underground minyanim when they weren't supposed to, all sorts of violations of the social distancing rules, including attending massive funeral processions, and even just yesterday, Lag BaOmer, the Jewish holiday, there were tons of groups of people in New York, as well as in other places around the world, where they were congregating in direct violation of these rules. And I think what's one of the things that's interesting, especially about the violations from just yesterday, is that initially a lot of commentators were talking about how there was an issue of lack of information on the part of members of the Haredi community, and therefore that might explain their behaviors, the flaunting of the social distancing rule. However, at this late stage, it's impossible to say that members of the Haredi community are aware of the rules or of the potential threat. To really talk seriously about why conditions exist that are perpetuating this type of irresponsible social gathering on the part of some members of the Haredi community.
All right. Thank you. And I will give you a chance to respond to each other too, after we sort of set up some general parameters. I think what all of you are referring to, and I think this is something that's very different in each of your contexts, are the ultra-Orthodox or the Haredi relationship to the state. And I'm hoping that each of you can address this in the context as well as the kinds of transnational relationships that we know exist among, different rabbinic authorities who have, for example, Rabbi Kanievsky initially early on wanted to keep the yeshivas open and made that ruling. And so people in New York, ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York, followed that, or at least some did. So those kinds of transnational networks are really interesting, as are the particular relationship of these kinds of communities to the state. So I'm asking you to speak to both of these issues. Ben, you want to begin again? We'll do our same order.
Sure. I think it's a great question because the tensions around the coronavirus really reveal and expose the kind of pre-existing dilemmas. So if we take the Haredi minority of the UK, they're very much described as a hard to reach group from a public health perspective. Now, what really does that mean? It has all these implications of shirking responsibilities to public health, especially around vaccinations. But healthcare, what is so interesting for the corona is healthcare is one of the few places where Haredi Jews and the state really directly engage and negotiate and exchange, because a lot of Haredi students will go to private fee-paying schools. There might be internal economies and there might be internal employment patterns, but healthcare is essential from a perspective of pekuach nefesh and from public health. So that, I think, is one of the most interesting places to see these pre-existing exchanges and negotiations. From a perspective of transnational network, actually it's something that me and Leah have been working on a paper, because there is this circulation of values of authority. So I think that's definitely something that we have identified between Europe, North America, and Israel. And that's something that seems to be there around the measles as well. Not only the kind of the circulation of infectious bodies, quote unquote, finger scare marks, but the kind of ideas around health and bodily care and bodily governance.
Leah,
so maybe I'll continue. So I'm going to start with a part 2 of the question, just to kind of continue Ben here. And maybe I'll give an example of who seems to be a little bit less in the network, which is really interesting. So Ben and I have been tracing kind of how ideas go between Jewish communities in general, and also the Haredi community between Israel, the UK, and the US. And what I found really, really interesting is that for example, the issue of mikveh guidelines. Can you go to the mikveh at this moment in time? So Israel came out with their guidelines, and both the US and the UK seemed to take those guidelines and work with them. But really, really interestingly, France did not. So in France, they closed the mikvahs. So it's really interesting to think which ideas are going, where they're going, and how these types of things are transnationally Jewish. So just to kind of end that off with what Ben said, and then to go back to the broader context of Israel and Haredim and the state, I'm assuming that most of the people in this conversation are very familiar with the fraught history of Haredim in the Israeli context, vis-a-vis Zionism, military, secular education, science education. There has been, from the beginning of the establishment of the state of Israel, the Haredim have been kind of othered in the Israeli context. All the citizens need to go to the army, but we learn Torah. So that type of kind of differing ideology, I think, is really, really, really important, thinking about it in the Israeli context, which out of the US, the UK, Israel is the only context here where there's some sort of debate within a Jewish state. So I think it's a really different context to think about and to think with about state-religion relationships. Yeah, I'll let Zalman go.
So I would say a few things. In terms of the internet Haredi networks and connections, it is clear, as Ayala mentioned, that information is being passed along, whether through the internet, smartphones, or all sorts of other networks and connections. So people in America know exactly what rabbis in Israel are saying, vice versa. And also, again, are in some cases local particularities, as Leah mentioned, in terms of rabbinic decisions about mikvot or other things. We are again seeing a large pattern of a consistent of Haredim in America, in England, in Israel, and elsewhere violating the social distancing guidelines that have been put forth by the secular authority. So that seems to be a persistent pattern in many locations. In terms of the local political configuration, I think that the New York City and New York State, the political authority figures have very close and complex relationships with the Haredi community. For instance, the New York City Mayor de Blasio came out with his now notorious tweet singling out the Jewish community for violating the social distancing guidelines, and that was immediately criticized by some quarters as being anti-Semitic or what have you. But the thing is that with less than 2 weeks later, it was revealed that Bill de Blasio personally intervened to soften the report of the Department of Education on the failure of Haredi yeshivas to teach secular education in their schools. So in other words, this is a very cozy and complicated relationship, so much so that some Haredi authority figures came out in support of the mayor's tweet because of their long-standing relationship. So essentially what we have here is a political establishment that has long-standing ties to Haredi and other communal authority figures in the Haredi community in New York. And because of those close ties, essentially, and the basis of those ties is that essentially the Haredi community will vote for particular political figures and ensure their political survival. And these figures will in turn allow the community to self-govern and sort of decide a lot of internal issues on their own. And because of this configuration of the relationship, it's actually caused tremendous harm to the Haredi community in the case of the coronavirus, because these political authorities are then unable to turn around and adequately and protect these communities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And we see very different configurations in terms of relationships to the state. I think we're mostly familiar with the US I speak for myself and Israel, and we know less about England, which is also interesting. I'd like to turn to the issue of science. So we know that the ultra-Orthodox and Haredim are certainly not anti-science, right? There's been a lot of embrace of, for example, in vitro fertilization. There's not been any, actually previously much resistance to vaccinations. I mean, it's been always an interesting aspect to ultra-Orthodox or Haredi life, how very much accepting of science, at least medical science, these communities have been. But with the measles outbreak and now coronavirus, I'm wondering if we're seeing a shift among a small group, and definitely not the majority, but a small group that is actually rethinking infectious disease, contagion, and the role of the state to enforce certain kinds of behavior. And I wonder if you could each speak about this in your national context.
I think you're definitely right to say that Haredim are not anti-science, because medical science is assimilated to further the aims of Haredi communities and religious authorities and Haredi worldviews. I think the link between the measles and the coronavirus is interesting, but it's also very nuanced. From when I was working in the UK around vaccine decision making, a lot of the concerns around, especially the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, was safety. Is this safe? And the kinds of sources of information influencing those decisions. And what I found was they're not that different to what circulates in the broader white British population. Those safety concerns are almost shared. It might be how they become articulated then in kind of religious frameworks, or how it gets assimilated and spoken about as a religious issue as well is a slightly different question. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I guess I'll let the rest of you answer and we'll see. Yeah, go ahead, Leah.
Yeah, so I'll go on then and say, I mean, the question about science, anti-science, is something that is very much at the heart of what I'm working on now. I'm starting to look at it in the context of Corona, but I want to offer kind of two different reflections. One is more broader and one is more specific to kind of reproduction, which is something that I've been working on for much longer than the Corona. The first thing I want to say is that and I kind of said this a little bit about the army vis-a-vis studying Torah beforehand, is that part of being a minority, and it's the same for an ethnic minority or a religious minority, means that you learn to cultivate a different framework. So while the authorities are saying X, you grow up learning that we say Y. And I think it's a very deep thing that's true for any minority, that there's some sort of configuration of your own theology and your own praxis as a critique of what's happening in, I guess, the host society, regardless of what it is. Now, I want to kind of build on that and give an example from reproduction, and just maybe to help understand how different frameworks develop. So when I was talking to couples about decision-making and about contraception, I quote this in some of the papers that I've written because I think it's a really vivid example. So I was once speaking to someone who told me, that she doesn't really want to have another child. She already had 3 or 4, I don't remember, but she said, I really want to take a break. I was looking for the right contraception, and then finally I found one that was 96%. So she was talking about the diaphragm, and she said, I'm going to go for that one. And I said, why? She said, because I don't want to have a child, but I want to leave space for God. So I really don't want a child is the 96%, but she wants to leave 4% for something else to happen. Now, I know it's not about Corona, but I think that it really exemplifies this idea of how far we want to take science. So she was telling me, I want to take this kind of scientific, rational percentage, but I want to add something to it. And I think that this is really, really, really central to religious thinking. And I find myself really intrigued by this intersection and how these borders between faith and technology are constructed in day-to-day life. And I think that Corona is giving us another opportunity to look at how that comes to be.
Thank you. Zalman?
Yeah, so I think to sort of echo some of what others have said, I think that when we Corona situation, we obviously understand that is to the Corona pandemic and the part of Haredim don't come out of a vacuum, right? That there is a history to and a sort of a chain of relationships and associations that produce the kinds of response that we're seeing with Corona. So in other words, I don't think that this is a new problem. I think that the response to the Haredi response to Corona is indicative of a profound sort of ideological and even philosophical stance on the part of the Haredi community. Specifically, although I don't think that they're anti-science, that's a misnomer and a hopeful way of framing things, because it implies that they're sort of like the Amish or something. And we know, obviously, that that's not the case. And as Ben and Ali already mentioned, in some ways, especially when it comes to medical science, the Haredi community is very embracing of all sorts of technological innovations in order especially to have more, but other things as well. But I think on a profound level, ideological level, there is a rejection of the authority, of secular authority in general, and scientific authority in particular. And we see this, again, not only with Corona, but for instance, with the Haredi response to Metzitza B'Peh, the circumcision technique that often, that could transmit herpes from the circumciser to the child. Even though, for instance, in New York government has come out against it, and essentially the Haredi community just continues to do it. We see it with the Haredi community's response in New York to the legal requirement of yeshivot to provide secular education to their students, where essentially they've spent millions of dollars constructing an entire apparatus to resist this legal enforcement. See it with the coronavirus. Again, it's not the case that all members of the Haredi community are violating the social distance requirements, absolutely not. But we do see the persistence of some people, and I think that this is indicative of this ideological resistance to the very idea of a separate, independent body of knowledge and quote unquote truth. And I think that you could say that part of what is particular about Haredism in comparison to other forms of Judaism is that it rejects the compilation of different areas of life or different knowledge. And it essentially says that there's one primary body of knowledge or one primary source of truth, and that is the Torah. So long as science or other scientific or secular knowledge, as long as it's not in conflict with the Torah, sure, we're happy to embrace it. So we'll use IVF and other things. But as soon as those bodies of knowledge come in conflict with the Torah, we always side with the Torah. And you see this in terms of their understanding of them, and in terms of many other issues where their primary allegiance is to the Torah. They feel that that is the authority in their life. And anything that violates that or weakens that or potentially threatens that, they're going to reject it. And I think the response of the Haredim to Corona exemplifies this position.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
I know it's not my turn, but yeah.
It's okay.
I wanted to kind of respond to kind of the last part of what you were saying. I mean, you kept on saying, you know, when it's science versus the Torah, so the Torah, but the Torah is so many different things. And, you know, the ideas of what is pious and what is right and what the Torah says at a particular moment in time is something that is constantly changing, right? It's never stuck in stone. It's always some sort of intersection of different things. And I think in this particular case, to go back, you know, in the Israeli context, in the beginning, it might have been the case that Haredim were really not getting the message as quick as everybody else. But then they did, you know, and most people are actually staying at home and offering new folks to talk with or to talk through. So, you know, and I found this really, really interesting is that, you know, in the beginning, there might have been a little ambivalence, but then when people got it, then they started offering religious frameworks. And then you have Haredim screaming at other Haredim and saying, you know, you guys are murderers, you need to stay at home. So there's a different, there's not always one view. And I think that's really interesting to think about because those things also reflect kind of different politics and dynamics within the Haredi community.
Yeah, I just to respond to that, I agree with you. And obviously, there's diversity within the Haredi community itself, of course. And obviously, all sorts of religious teachings could be interpreted or framed in all sorts of ways, no doubt. And some of that, as you said, a sort of more creative, flexible interpretation of classical sources or of Jewish law certainly goes on. I guess to me, the part that I find striking is the sort of empirical that the Haredi community all around the world, by and large, was much slower to respond to the pandemic than many other communities, not necessarily all, but many other communities, neighboring communities. So that's sort of one data point that I think we have to take seriously. And then the second one is even now, when many Haredi authority figures have come out, against the violations of the social distancing rules, we still see violations of those rules, and not in a insignificant way. Again, just literally yesterday, Lag BaOmer in America, in Israel, in Golders Green, in London, we see violations, persistence of violations. So I think that those two data points together tell us that there's something that is going on here that we really need to come to understand. And I think that's why the issue of the rejection of secular knowledge, and especially science, when it's perceived as being in conflict with Torah or Torah values, is an important place to look. But obviously, it's a complex story, and that certainly doesn't tell the whole story.
Thank you. So you're all really talking about trying to explain this lack of early compliance. Then some people are compliant in the community, some are not. There's clearly divisions, there's questions of authority. So I'm gonna pose two questions to you that I hope kind of gets at that. I think most of us agree that the issue of information, maybe Leah, you don't as much, but the issue of information getting out into the communities in terms of seriousness was not the key issue. I don't think, maybe initially, but at least from my knowledge of the New York scene, and I think Zalman, you agree, right? People get information. There's lots of ways to get information. It wasn't as if they were living in hermetically sealed neighborhoods right in Brooklyn. So the question is, what's going on and how do we understand that in these different national contexts that are so different and yet are sharing certain behaviors? So I guess one of my first questions in regards to this is the kind of anti-Semitic question. And is it just, as someone posted recently in some blog or op-ed, is it just that ultra-Orthodox Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews and Haredim are more visible? So my question to you all is, since before the pandemic, anti-Semitism has certainly been on the rise in Europe, in the States, really fulfilling many of ultra-Orthodox and Haredi worst fears. How do we distinguish between that and legitimate critique of behaviors which endanger others?
I think it's a great question, and anti-Semitism in the UK has been rising year on year, and the Community Security Trust have got really strong reports and records to evidence that. And I think the most recent one was how the coronavirus had spread anti-Semitic conspiracies, that Jews were causing this pandemic or benefiting from pandemic. And it really, echoes the words of what Jonathan Sachs had said, that anti-Semitism is like a virus that mutates and changes forms. And this has, been demonstrated very, very clearly in the coronavirus. To answer your second question of how it can be separated from legitimate critique of conduct, it's a difficult one, and I think that we need to look also beyond the Haredi community to see different forms of responding and non-compliance in also the general population of the UK. My sister who lives in the UK was telling me, that she was out walking her dog and saw just groups of people and people congregating and people outside, and when it starts to get spring and everybody sees sun, they're straight away outside. So it's not only been the Haredim, and we know that it's been all sorts of populations, and what I think is dangerous and what I think is interesting is how one becomes scapegoated and blamed for that when there's been what we could say a broad issue with respecting the compliance. And again, I think this is where it comes to country context, where the UK was just so ambiguous from the very beginning. We advise you was a government position. Now it's stay alert. So everyone would be forgiven for kind of taking these mixed messages and maybe not knowing what to do immediately, at the beginning and now at this stage.
Thank you, Ben.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Do you want to say something, Ayla?
I was just wondering, Ben, if you were saying that in general there was ambiguity in the British context for everybody. Is that what you're saying?
For sure at the beginning. And then I think it's not until towards the end of March when the UK government had said, okay, now it's lockdown. But within those critical weeks of trying to assimilate, trying to understand, people could be absolutely forgiven for not fully knowing what to do, how to respond, and then seeing how different communities became the face of non-compliance. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Leah, go ahead.
Yeah, so to go back, I guess, to the Israel context, the anti-Semitic context is obviously not the biggest thing that's the one that it doesn't set the course here in Israel, obviously, but I would take the Israeli case to go back to these really kind of complicated and fractured relationships between Haredi Jews in Israel and the state, whatever we want to call that in this case. And I think that, I said this at the beginning a little bit, but there has been a very kind of historical ambivalence, and ambivalence is a nice word, I guess, to talk about the relationship between the state and Haredi Jews in Israel. And I cannot tell you how many Haredi Jews in Israel I've spoken to who have been so upset by how much they've been vilified and pointed at for not abiding the rules. And, it's something that it's kind of hard to know how media decides to report some things, not to report other things. But I have not seen in the Israeli media anything showing Haredim abiding rules when I know that many of them are. So it's a really complicated, I think, tension there, and I don't know where it's going to lead. But I want to say one more thing about the information that I think is really different in both the UK and the US compared to Israel. In Israel, before Corona, there was about 50% Haredim using internet and 50% who were not. Now, there's other factors to put in here, but what I find really, really interesting is that at this moment in time, many, many more Haredim have decided to bring internet into homes for many, many different reasons. They have also seen much more soldiers than they've ever seen in their life in the streets of Bnei Brak. So there's a lot of changes that are happening. And many Haredim look historically back and show the moment that during one of the Israeli wars that they brought the radio into their homes. And Corona will probably be remembered as the time that they brought the internet into their homes and that, soldiers started walking on the streets of Bnei Brak. So what is that going to do? I have no idea, but it's really, really, really interesting to try to track what types of new haredi state relationality will emerge from this moment?
Yeah. Let me just add, Leah, which something that I learned from you actually, which is that there are, though, it's not merely the Israeli state versus Haredim, like the Minister of Health is himself a Haredi Jew, right? So
100%.
So there's a lot of complicated relationships there. It's not merely in opposition to, but you're absolutely right that I think we're going to see big changes, of course, for everybody. But our topic today, ultra-Orthodox Jews and Haredim. Yeah, Zalman, go ahead.
So a few things. The first thing I wanted to say is in terms of between Haredim, let's say in America, and other non-Jews in America who also violate social distance rules. And I think it's certainly really interesting and we're thinking about the relationship between the gun-toting Trump supporters who have come out in public demanding, literally at the point of a gun, that businesses reopen or what have you, and Haredim. Now, obviously, there's a kind of superficial, basic connection that many Haredim are Trump supporters. So you know, on one level, they have sort of political connection. But also, I think on a deeper level, going back to this kind of rejection of science as a model or a framework for truth, or certainly the dominant model or framework for truth, and some Trump supporters, some of them may have political opposition, so to speak, to Corona, that they see Corona as a political maneuver on the part of mainstream media or what have you to tarnish the president and so on. But some of them who are the Christian fundamentalists may also have similar types of kind of philosophical or ideological issues, so to speak, with science and with scientific knowledge and scientific reality. So that is something interesting to explore. In terms of the media portrayal and anti-Semitism, I think that's a really important issue. And certainly in America, in New York, in America, Haredim have a key face of non-compliance in the media. And it was interesting, some people may have seen on Facebook, there were memes flying around recently that showed police violently breaking up relatively small gatherings of people of color in poor New York neighborhoods, and hundreds of people, primarily white, middle class people sunbathing in Central Park, and without any kind of police presence. So there were articles about the tale of two cities, and you could really say that it's a tale of three cities. That for the largely African American Latino community, they're often policed and surveilled, and the rules against to enforce social distancing are often enforced at the end of a baton. Whereas for the Haredim, they're sort of hassled and given summonses or tickets or things like that. And for middle class or upper class, primarily white New York residents, they're essentially given a free pass and able to do whatever kind of social gathering they want. So obviously this is a very problematic issue, which highlights the deep racist nature of media portrayals in general, and also the way that Haredim are often unfairly presented in the media. In terms of how to deal with the sort of sincere criticisms of the Haredi community and how to distinguish that from anti-Semitism, I think that anti-Semitism, like all forms of prejudice, includes a move to generalize about an entire population. So certainly, as we've been doing here in this discussion, when we start to talk the fact that many Haredim are absolutely abiding by the rules of social distancing, and that there's variation within the Haredi community itself. I think that sort of gets us away from the problematic approach of generalizing a small behavior to the entire group. Also, when we think about anti-Semitism or any kind of prejudice, it often assumes that whatever problem you're discussing is genetic or intrinsic to the people of that group. And clearly what we're talking about here is a learned behavior. We're not saying that there's something fundamentally wrong with Haredim. We're saying that there are political relationships between Haredi figures and secular authorities. There's structures within the Haredi community that may be causing problems. But that Haredim, like everyone else, are perfectly capable of learning and changing their behavior based on new information. And that's what we hope will happen in this case.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually seen that to a large extent in a lot of situations. I just want to highlight, and this is really my last question, and we'll turn to the audience questions in a second, but all of you have mentioned, and I think this is an important point, that there are many other groups, obviously, who are also rejecting social distancing with different kinds of political responses to those groups based on the particular context. But I just wonder if we can think out loud together how we compare ultra-Orthodox Jews and Haredim to other folks who either had different value systems or other explanatory frameworks for coronavirus, and different ways of dealing with it. And I think probably the most obvious correlation are some church communities who've also been refusing to social distance and sort of touting the value of prayer. So alternative kinds of sort of prophylaxis. So anybody who wants to take that on, go for it.
Well, go ahead, David. Ben.
No, you go.
Well, just briefly, again, I sort of touched on that before. Some of the support on the part of Trump supporters opposing the social distancing guidelines, or even putting pressure to reopen businesses. Again, some of that is sort of political and whatever, sort of a whole separate issue. But some of it absolutely come from sort of evangelical, fundamentalist Christian understandings of science, of medicine, of the healing power of prayer, and so on. I know one Republican politician recently said that he refused to wear a face mask because he felt that humans were created in the image of God, and to wear a face mask would be to sort of diminish the image of God or something. So clearly there are ways that some groups of non-Haredim, non-Jews are using themes, symbols, ideas from religion to justify their violations of the social distancing guidelines. And I think it gets a little bit complicated how much of this is based on religious grounds and how much of it is based on political or economic grounds, and that religion is basically being used as a cover to justify what otherwise may be hard or impossible to justify.
Thank you. Ben, why don't you go ahead?
Just to kind of answer the question from a slightly different direction, and I hope it's still relevant. I know from the UK, almost every ethnic minority group has been disproportionately affected by coronavirus compared to the general white British population. And that raises some other questions, structural questions around overcrowding, deprivation, and how these are, the structural neglect has created the enabling conditions as well for minorities to be disproportionately affected. So I don't know if that's relevant, but just to put another perspective of impact and why some groups have been more vulnerable than others.
Yeah, I would completely continue in that direction. I think it's a really important factor to think about here. I think that, at this point in our conversation, I think it's really helpful to think about structural aspects of inequality. I think it's really, really important, Ben, and I'm happy that you raised that. And I echo that. And one more thing that I wanted to say is that I find that on the one hand, it's really, it makes a lot of sense to compare it to other religious and ethnic minorities. And I wanted to say one more, not really a group, but in the Israeli context, the Corona thing was, it was also very much part of a political kind of uncertainty about, who the next prime minister is going to be. And one of the other groups that's been very, very vocal about going out and doing things that are communal is actually people who wanted to demonstrate against Bibi and put rallies together, etc. And they're not a religious group, they're not an ethnic minority, they're quite complete opposite in that regard. But I think that it's really important to think, and this is a question that I've been thinking about a lot, and Ben and I've been thinking about a lot, is that, when a pandemic comes out and you get these kind of guidelines, there's a very much underlying understanding of what is essential and what is not. What are things that people should be continuing at this moment in time, and what are things that should not? And the question is, who gets to decide what is essential? And I think it's a really powerful question. And it also, again, to continue, Ben, about the structural differences, it's also inequality, it's also poverty, but it's also who's in charge and who gets to make those decisions. Now, you're right, Ayala, to remind me of my own stuff, that, that the head Minister of Health, Litzman, is a haredi, he's a Hasid Gur. But, by this moment in time, things have changed, and he will probably not continue to be the Minister of Health in Israel for various reasons. But how much impact did he have on the guidelines? I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to turn to the questions, and I'll start to just take them in order. And I think I'm going to read a few, and I'll just open it up to you all, and you can jump in where you feel like you can. The first one is, would you note in their separate statements of Friday, May 8th, that Agudas Yisrael of America has advised following government permission to officially reopen synagogues, while the OU-RCA has advised waiting an additional 14 days because of pikuach nefesh, so saving people. So the quote is a paraphrase based on conversation with Stuart Ditchek, who's a prominent doctor. So I guess that question is about differences in approaching this next phase. And I know that somebody else also asked a very similar question. Danny Sawyer asked, can you tell us some of the differences between how yeshivish and Hasidic communities are responding? Because we've used these very overarching terms as a shorthand, but of course there are many deep differences between them. So I leave that to you.
I don't work on the US context, so I wonder if first someone could speak to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, as you said, there are important differences. I guess for me personally, I'm always struck in situations of the overarching similarities. So obvious differences between particular rabbis. There are, I think one thing, speaking of differences, there was a letter from the modern Orthodox, Israel and Deerfield, where they basically came out and said that some of their members were at a quote-unquote rogue minyan, underground minyan, and that they were essentially stripping those people of any position in the synagogue, and that they were going to forfeit their opportunity to be part of, to get any kibbudim, any kind of honorary ecclesiastical positions in the synagogue, getting an aliyah or what have you, as a penalty for violating the rules. So when we speak about differences, again, this is a modern Orthodox group, but I think what's interesting, again, is that as far as I know, no haredi or ultra-Orthodox group came out with sedition. So even though individual rabbis may have changed, came out with statements in America and in Israel saying that yes, they should keep the yeshivas closed, or encouraging their members to follow the guidelines. As far as I know, no Haredi authority has taken it to the next level of saying, hey, if you violate the guidelines, you're actually going to be punished in a significant way from the community itself. And again, I think that's very telling, both in terms of, and clearly the Haredi community in many other respects, it doesn't shy away from all kinds of things to members who violate, perceive as important religious precepts or guidelines. But in this case, we do see that kind of internal policing. And I think that that speaks volumes much more than exactly what kind of statement support religious authority figures have come out in recent times.
Thank you, Zalman. I would just add for 2 more minutes, I'm actually very curious to hear what other questions we have out there. And I think that it's really important to remember that there really is not one Haredi community. I think that using that term is really, really problematic. In my writing, I try to be to steer clear from that, because I think it's part of an imagination and it's part of an othering. And I think that it's really important to divide it into different groups. And there's obviously a big difference between Hasidic and more Lithuanian oriented Haredim. I wanted to add one more thing that we haven't really spoken about, and I'm sorry you didn't ask this question exactly, but I will just add and say that one of the power dynamics that I've found really, really hard is that, I don't know how many of you saw this, but the Moroccan kind of rabbis in Israel came out right before Passover with a pretty big psak saying that people can do seder on Zoom. And very, very quickly, I don't even know what word to use to say how quickly they were just, right? And, you know, it tells us so much, not only about power dynamics within the community, but also about race and ethnicity and about power dynamics that, as I said in the beginning, when it just continues to show us these power dynamics that we have within the Haredi community. And when the RCA and kind of the OU came out with, well, you can call somebody on the first night, and there's these 3 days of Pesach, you know, if somebody feels like they need a phone call, make a phone call. Nobody went out against them. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. Let me ask another sort of, I'm going to put 2 questions together, and this is in regard to vaccines. This person is asking if there wasn't an effort in the US context of evangelical Christian communities, and we know that anti-vaxxers are not only evangelicals, right? They are actually kind of strange, unlikely groupings of people from many sort of opposite ends of the political spectrum. But that speaks to, in terms of the anti-science, anti-certain kinds of state-mandated science, I guess we would say in particular, how that speaks to new kinds of relationships with other political, maybe religious, ethnic groups within the national context. So I wondered if you all could speak to that. Like, let me just ask Ben to speak to that, because I'm really curious. I mean, I have heard and done some reading on the anti-vax campaign here and how that was sort of mediated through some modern Orthodox Jews, but also through the wider national anti-vax movement. And Zalman sort of alluded to some of those political tensions, but what about in the UK?
Sure. I think if from the UK data, there was definitely this assimilation of what we might call anti-vax material and information, and engaging with those sources and kind of articulating those kinds of claims making or truth claims around vaccine safety. What I can definitely say from my work here in Israel is that there are these forging of alliances between otherwise self-protective Haredi Jews who very, very cautiously engage with the outside world and forms of internet and forms of information. So how those are kind of circulating through the community is really, really interesting, and how people like Del Bigtree, who's certainly not a Haredi Jew, have come to be a kind of figurehead for people in the Haredi community who hold staunch anti-vax positions.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I've not really worked on vaccines, so I don't really know how
Okay.
to answer that.
Here are a few other questions that are around similar issues. Some of it is about trying to understand in terms of a kind of theological frame. Many questions address why, I'm going to paraphrase one, why don't they consider saving a life one of the most Torah laws, taking precedence over other laws like rabbinic authority? And a second component that I will add to this from another question is, do you think that the high death rates and the deep losses in Haredi communities will undermine Das Torah and this allegiance to rabbinic authority?
So if I could jump in a bit on that. So in terms of saving life, of course, that is a primary Jewish religious obligation. But part of the complexity here is determining who's at risk. You know, how do we know that? And when do we know that? So it's sort of like an epistemological question. And I think that that's where the issues is raising about the rejection of science and scientific knowledge comes into play and real complications. Because essentially, I think Haredi communities would say, well, once we really know that lives are at risk and that this is a very serious a mortal threat to our community, sure, we'll respond as best we can. But in order to get there, you have to, quote unquote, believe in science. You have to believe in your senses to be able to tell you what's going on in the world. And especially something like an epidemic, which is the actual threat is invisible, right? It's only the consequences of the threat, the people dying that you see, but the threat itself is invisible. And therefore, it takes, at least initially, a certain amount of trust in secular figures, in secular science, in secular scientific knowledge. Okay, what the CDC and other experts, epidemiologists are saying, you know, we're going to sort of give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think on some level, you could say that Haredi communities, at least initially, were not willing to give these authority figures the benefit of the doubt. They said, you know, prove it. Well, they proved it. You know, it wreaked havoc in Haredi community. And then Haredi started to sort of believe more that this is actually a problem they need to deal with. In terms of your second question about the status of religious authority figures post-corona, unfortunately, I'm not especially optimistic that this is really going to change a great deal, because I think that, again, the reason why Haredi community members went along with the recommendations or rulings of their leaders, even if they were demonstrably counterproductive, is because of the complex structure in place in these communities. And Peter Berger talked about plausibility, structures of plausibility, right? How do we know if something is true or not? A lot of it comes back to what is the basic structure of our understanding of the world or of society. And things that are in line with that structure are considered plausible. We believe them. They seem to make sense to us. Things that are contradict those structures seem implausible. And I think because of that, it's most likely that most Haredi community members will continue to trust and believe in the religious authority figures of their community. I think for a minority of people who are already sort of in touch with secular knowledge, maybe they're starting to go to college, maybe they're some of the hidden heretics who are using smartphones to Google things online, you know, before Corona hit. For those people, yes, the catastrophe within the Haredi community may may increase their skepticism of their own religious authority figures. But I think that that will probably be only for a minority of members in the Haredi community.
So I want to say two things, and one is I would say not a critique, but I just want to add something more, is that I feel like part of our discussion here, there's a lot of underlying assumptions about the ways that people make decisions. As an anthropologist who's really very interested in decision making, you know, people don't only make decisions, Haredim, non-Haredim, people in general. It's not only about intellectual understanding. There are many, many studies in science communication, science education, other areas of study that have proven once and again that it's not just what we know that makes us make decisions. So the question that you asked, Ayala, about, you know, don't they understand that saving lives is the most important?
Right.
Right? So, of course, I think every human being that we would ask would tell us that saving lives is really, really, really important. So I think that I totally get that question, but I think that we need to unpack these kind of underlying assumptions about how Haredim are making decisions and how all of us make decisions. And I want to give one example, and then I'll say something about language and Haredi religious language. I mean, so many people smoke. So many people smoke, even though they pick up the thing and it says that it will kill them, right? So we know from other areas of our life that that's not the only way people make decisions. I'm going to just put that there. The other thing I want to talk about is about language. So you asked about kind of we have a religious obligation in the Jewish sources to be careful and to watch ourselves as much as we can and not cause harm to ourselves and to another. 100%. The question is, where does that apply? How do we go from this general obligation to use it in a particular case? Now, one more second and I'll give one more example, but one of the things that I found really, really interesting is that at the earlier stages when there was uncertainty and people were not sure, definitely in the UK, people had no idea, but already in Israel and the US, people were still uncertain, and religious WhatsApps, both in modern Orthodox but especially in Haredi communities, you suddenly had people from the community who are doctors, nurses at the NHS in the UK, people in Israel. The Israeli health ministry started a whole campaign that is about targeting and explaining to Haredim in their own language about the dangers of the corona. But I think that the more effective way or also effective way was having a religious doctor saying, guys, listen to me. It's really, really dangerous. And having somebody from within who you trust, and you trust their ideas about what science is, what truth is, what I should believe, that I think was even more convincing because it didn't have that kind of history of not being sure that they're really telling us the truth.
I'm going to jump in before you do, Ben. That answer to that question, Leah, thank you. That actually was, many people have also posted questions on what advice you would give, you know, to authorities who are hoping to make a difference. And I think you answered that, which is have a kind of intermediary. And I don't know, I've seen a lot of intermediaries just on WhatsApp and on Facebook and YouTube who are modern Orthodox Jews usually trying to do just that. But the translation effort, I know in the UK into Yiddish, was also very effective. Okay, sorry, Ben. Go ahead.
No, I think, you know, just to follow on from that, that there are some wonderful examples of these kinds of collaborations. For example, the Orthodox Jewish Nurses Task Force, who came to really work hard to dismiss, misunderstandings around vaccine safety in the Orthodox and Haredi Jewish communities. And then, of course, you have other kinds of services like Ezrat Nashim and Atzola and the Shomrim, who have this incredible position of speaking to statutory services and public health, but also to the Haredi community and creating a dialogue and translation. And I think that they have been working extremely hard in this situation, and kol hakavod to them. I wondered if I could, because I saw one of the questions that was specifically asking about gender, and it's something that we didn't really touch on.
Yes, good. That was my next question. Go, good.
So I wondered, Ayala, if you could take that question, because I'm sure Leah will also be able to really speak to this.
Yes, actually it's Valentina, who you might know. She said, my question is about the gender line of the reaction. If there is one, we're talking a lot about general response, the authority response. What about the lived experience? Is there a difference between how mothers and fathers, men and women react? And she's talking about mothers here, and they seem extremely aware of the potential risk. I'm going to fold in another series of questions, which was about education. I think that's going to be quite relevant since education is happening at home for the first time. Usually, you know, kids are off in their separate schools, boys and girls. So any aspect of that question that you want to take on, go for it.
Do you want to go, Ben, or?
I mean, from a couple of conversations that I was having here in Israel, not in the UK, was with some Haredi mothers who were actually quite happy that there was this pause, there was this closure, that they could firstly be at home with the kids and see more of their husbands, particularly on Shabbat, when one woman was saying, but you know, it's Shabbat and my husband is in synagogue and it's the one day of the week that we're together. And now there was this feeling like that they were together. And whereas on a normal, in the world that came before Corona, you know, she was juggling all these different commitments and work and childcare and shopping and this and this. And she was saying just the awe of being with her children. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I guess one of the questions, and I think I would like to know what Leah says, is when so much of authority is gendered, how does that kind of be reconciled with, say, women and with mothers?
Yeah, so I'll say safety. So thank you so much, Ben. I love that story that you just told about that mother. I'll say two things about the gender. Thank you to whoever asked the question. I've been waiting for that. So I think that when you think about communal Haredi Jewish life, right, it's of course gendered, and religious ritual is very much gendered. So whereas the men who are typically, you know, those who are full-time yeshiva, those who are part-time, whatever it is, you know, yeshiva learning, synagogue, if you're Hasidic, being with the Rebbe, whatever it is, it's very much the men that are suddenly at home, and trying to carve out new spaces for religiosity at home within these settings. So some of it will provoke kind of new thinkings of Jewish law. What can I say when I'm davening by myself, or what do I need a minyan for? Questions like that. But it's also suddenly really, really interesting because it revisits the inner family dynamics within that. And also just to say that, you know, a lot of times we imagine kind of, you know, a full family, you know, a mother, a father, a full heterosexual family. But there's of course different aspects of gender, even in the Haredi community. And it's really interesting to suddenly see how women are doing things that they've never done before, or men and women praying in the same space in a small home. And what does that look like? It's really, really, really interesting. And I'll just add that education in the home is really interesting because the whole learning at home, at least in Israel, you have to have a computer. Yes. In most cases, right? And if you, I mean, even the 50% of Haredi Jews in Israel who have internet, not all of them will have a central computer. Sometimes they'll have a laptop that's only for work. There's different configurations of that. A lot of them, they started out trying to do education at home on the phone, and all of the phone lines kept on crashing because they couldn't handle so many people learning on the phone. Some Haredim have started to allow their kids to watch more and of more diverse backgrounds to allow, more time, etc. I know that we're out of time, so I could chat about this for another hour and a half, but I'm going to let Zalman go.
Very briefly, I'll just say that if you think of, again, the media portrayal, the face of the corona violations in the Haredi community, they're often men. And that relates to the fact that men are often, in a lot of the Haredi communities, the primary people involved in social or communal activities. So if you think about the funerals, the public gathering for the funerals, they're often men that are gathering. If you think about the Lag BaOmer celebrations yesterday, they're often men that are gathering, because these are often the people who are doing gathering when there's no corona. And therefore, when even during corona, when there's going to be social violations, male members of the community that are doing those violations. Education, there's so much that can be said about it. One very quick thing is, I know for some people that are concerned about secular education in the Haredi community, the fact that people are home now, in some case, has made it possible for them to get some of that secular instruction through the internet, whereas before Corona, when they were spending the entire day in yeshiva, that was less of a possibility. But there's, as was already mentioned, both gender, education, there's just so many different aspects of it, how it plays out with Corona.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing that I forgot about education is that there is one part of the Haredi community that is actually really, really prepared for home schooling and for online learning, and that's Chabad.
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah.
Could I mention one quick thing about that?
Sure.
And actually, I was thinking about this when I was talking about the or the rejection of scientific knowledge, and how it is a very complex thing, and it's not simply a question of anti or pro, right? So Chabad, yes, they're very set up in a way because they're dealing with shluchim, emissaries all around the world the whole time and trying to provide them religious instruction. But on an even deeper level, the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself was very supportive of computer technology and other telecommunication systems in order to help get the message of the community out. So again, it's certainly not the case that Chabad or even Haredi communities are completely, quote unquote, anti-science. It's much more of a question happens when science is perceived as conflicting with religious beliefs or attitudes.
Yeah, and I guess we would want to put science and technology together, because I think the attitude towards those are very similar. If the science or the technology works with religious authority, it's really quite unproblematic. It's a question of when it challenges certain practices or beliefs. I will also add that I've seen a lot on social media circulating about opportunities for Hasidic boys to have exposure to secular education. They can sign up for it through Zoom. And also that, from my understanding, at least here in the US, women were at the forefront of the anti-vax. And I do wonder how that's gonna play out here, more as mothers who take their kids to the doctors. And so that's an interesting kind of relationship of gender too. I'd like to just conclude with one more question that I think returns us to the kind of issue of media coverage and of how Haredi Jews are being portrayed more generally. Jonah Boyarin asks, what are the consequences of thinking about Haredim as a culture, and in terms of, I'm sorry, I'm butchering his question, but in terms of violations of social distancing, thinking about Haredim as a culture or a religion, and thinking about individuals who are not social distancing in Central Park or downtown, right? So are we kind of treating ultra-Orthodox Jews as this coherent whole and othering them, especially in media accounts and maybe in academia too? And are we treating violators as who are not ultra-Orthodox or religious as somehow just individuals and not part of movements? Or we could say maybe millennials or whatever, but we don't do that as frequently, both in academia and in the media, I think, if anyone wants to speak to that.
Well, I'm happy to start by saying, you know, Ben, when you started, you kind of went back to the title of this panel and talked about kind of Orthodox versus the state. And we know that both of those categories need to be taken apart into many, many different pieces. And obviously it's a good title and no critique for me, but you know, it's a good title because it gives us the essence of what we want to speak about. But I hope that at this point, you know, I think that for us and for anybody listening, that I think it's very, very clear that there's not one Orthodox, there's not one state. And the question that you're asking, Jonathan, is obviously a kind of a big question about, can we see religious groups as culture? Can we see them as individuals, as groups? It's a big question, but I think that especially the questions that we kind of got to towards the middle about anti-Semitism really, really pose this kind of the stakes of what it means when we talk about people as groups versus individuals. And I think that that's something that we all have to be really careful about.
Absolutely, Lee. I think you're definitely right with, in terms of the culturalizing of Haredim that has been going on, and it's touched on so many of the things that we've spoken about. Why, for example, as Zalman was saying, in kind of the Black American communities, where there's probably more police patrolling anyway because of issues around structural racism, that it becomes an easy way to kind of culturalize a people as responding in a particular way when those things are going on in the kind of the white British general population, or here in Israel where there were people on the beaches of Tel Aviv as well. So, but just to kind of also, if I think, and I think it's relevant to look at the culturalizing of public health of Haredi Jews. Public health is also culture in itself, and is like any other social community and form of social organization. And I think we should also keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think it's interesting when I was trying to picture who are the other social violators of the social distance rules, and I think it's interesting to me. Some of them can be sort of clearly defined, if imperfectly. Trump supporters, whether they again come from a right framework, or just a politically conservative, as that's understood in America, whatever, framework that get the government off my back or whatever. And so those are sort of fairly, defined groups. But then there's just young people who are flocking to beaches, people who are flocking to the grassy areas in the Central Park, New York, right? Are they part of a particular ideology or framework, right? And some of that, I think, some of those people might be like, goop people, people that are sort of caught up in a kind of millennial anti-science, pro new age, whatever ritualistic and consumption patterns, whatever. And some of them might, who knows? So yeah, I think it's a real mixed bag. And certainly, again, as I've been saying the whole time, when we think about Haredim, as was already said, we're talking about all sorts of groups of clearly identifiable groups of people, Hasidim, and so on, as well as many individuals making up those groups, and some of those individuals have very different views on things that we're talking about today.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to leave you with one more question, and that you don't have to answer, but I think it's an interesting one, and I think we could all sort of it's nice to leave with a question. So one person wrote, "I'm very interested in risk and Leah's analogy with smoking. So the question here is, how do Haredim negotiate concepts of risk, and has this been studied?" And I think we could extend that to a much broader national context in terms of risk. I think that's sort of one of the key issues, and those kinds of political alliances that lead different communities and individuals to really to evaluate and make judgments about different kinds of risks, right? Both theological, spiritual, bodily, all those kinds of risks. That's a really good question. We are going to wrap up. I want to thank you so much. We'll try to answer your questions through typing after, but I want to mainly thank our panelists so much for such a great conversation. I'm going to applaud you, and we can't hear anybody else. And I again want to thank the Board of Jewish Studies, and of course our audience who came and wrote such wonderful questions that were really provocative. So I hope everybody takes care, and I hope we get to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.